Nuremberg, 1945. The second largest city in Bavaria lays in ruins. After almost 6 years of the Second World War, Germany had surrendered unconditionally on May 8th. Adolf Hitler, Germany's infamous dictator, committed suicide a month before, leaving his beloved country to fall apart. The Nazi Party no longer imposed their notorious violence and corruption, and the country must rebuild after a war that saw it torn apart. Now Nuremberg, where the Nazi Party once celebrated arrogant rallies, was to become the scene of the party's reckoning before the law. The victorious powers, the USA, the Soviet Union, Great Britain, and France, are setting up an international military tribunal for this purpose, to serve justice for wars of aggression, mass murders, and 12 years of dictatorship. Powerful Nazi leaders who once dreamed of world domination were now sitting on the wooden benches in a courtroom, nervously awaiting the fate of their crimes. Crimes they never thought would become public knowledge.
So the trial was a rational and civilized response to the irrationality and the brutality of the Nazi regime.
What Nuremberg represents to so many of these Nazis is a real reckoning that they never thought they were going to receive.
The once seemingly invincible political party was now left in ruins. Just a bad memory for German society. Justice is going to be served.
Even during the Second World War, it was realized by the Allies that it was absolutely vital that Nazi war criminals should be brought to justice. In 1943, there was this thing called the Moscow Declaration that announced that all these criminals would be chased, quotes, to the utmost ends of the earth and brought to justice. This was to achieve two things. First, to tell any Nazi war criminal, we're on to you. You're not going to get away with what you're doing because we're going to win this war, and then we're going to come and find you, and then we're going to come and bring you to justice. And also the people in the occupied territories could see the Moscow Declaration and go, good, the Allies are going to do something about this, and it means that these people may commit fewer criminal acts against us if they're worried that when the war's over, the Allies are going to come and get them. What this leads to is what is called the International Military Tribunal, or the IMT, at the German city of Nuremberg, which was a kind of cradle of Nazism. It was where you had all these massive Nazi rallies. And this International Military Tribunal, which we now today call the Nuremberg Trials, took place at the Palace of Justice in Nuremberg, largely because it was relatively unbombed and unscathed, but also it was very symbolic. And from about 1945-46 to 49, there were several trials that took place at Nuremberg. But the one that most people associate is the International Military Tribunal of around 20 top Nazi figures. And that was to show the world that actually there could be some justice meted out, not just by one country, but all the Allies, the French, the Russians, the Americans, and the British. It was very radical at the time. There had never been an international criminal court like it. And so this was a kind of coming together of a lot of different legal systems, a lot of different political systems, all coming together and saying to the world, listen, these people who commit war crimes, these people who commit genocide, these people who commit crimes against humanity, they are never, ever going to get away with it ever again.
The Palace of Justice in Nuremberg, Germany, once the holy city of Nazism, becomes the setting of an epic event in the progress of mankind. Here, under the vigilant eyes of American MPs, the 20 most important surviving members of the Hitler Gang go on trial. The attention of all the world is centered on this city and this scene. High representatives of France, Britain, America, and Russia form the tribunal. For the United States, former Attorney General Francis Biddle. They will judge the ringleaders of a conspiracy that brought war to all the world for their crimes against peace and humanity.
Held for the purpose of bringing Nazi war criminals to justice. The Nuremberg trials were a series of 13 trials carried out in Nuremberg, Germany, between 1945 and 1949. The defendants, who included Nazi Party officials and high-ranking military officers, along with German industrialists, lawyers, and doctors, were indicted on such charges as crimes against peace and crimes against humanity. Shortly after Adolf Hitler came to power as Chancellor of Germany in 1933, he and his Nazi government began implementing policies designed to persecute German Jewish people and other perceived enemies of the Nazi state.
Hitler had made this view quite plain. It must be remembered that Mein Kampf was no mere private diary in which the secret thoughts of Hitler were set down. Its contents were rather proclaimed from the housetops. It was used in the schools and university of force as the means of solving international problems.
Over the next decade, these policies grew increasingly repressive and violent and resulted in the systematic state-sponsored murder of some 6 million European Jews, along with an estimated 4 million to 6 million non-Jews by the end of World War II.
Between 1933 and 1945, the Nazis were very much concerned to purify and cleanse German society, and they put into place a whole range of measures and laws in order to do this. One of the early laws was the sterilization law, which was to stop hereditary diseases going down generations. Ultimately, during the war, there was the euthanasia campaign, which was codenamed Action T4, which was essentially the mass murder of the asylum population. So the mentally and the physically ill were eradicated. As well as during the war, the genocide of European Jews, so known as the Final Solution, and the genocide of the Sinti and the Roma, who they called the Gypsies.
The Allied forces, Britain, France, the United States, and Russia, all came to the agreement that they wanted to persecute any living Nazi Party official for the crimes they had committed.
What you have to remember is there were an enormous amount of war criminals. There was a list put together by the nascent United Nations, and there was a central registry of war criminals and security suspects. That was called CROCAS, this somewhat funny name. And if you look at the CROCAS wanted list, it's a book, about several inches thick. And, I've got a copy of it, and it's got name after name after name after name of people wanted for crimes against humanity, war crimes. So anybody from Hitler, A, to some local mayor who had shot an RAF pilot who had bailed out of his plane because he was angry that the RAF had just bombed his city. So you got what one British war crimes investigator described, almost bewildered, as this sheer volume of criminality. And so when you see the Nuremberg trial, the main one with 20 guys in the dock, you've got to remember behind those are ranks upon ranks of tens of thousands of people who committed the most terrible crimes in their names.
The 4 Allied countries all had different justice systems and decided that rather than try each man 4 times, they would come to an agreement on how they would run the trials. The London Charter for the Nuremberg trials, held in August 1945, saw the Allied countries agree on a trial and tribunal court system, in which each country would have a judge present. They decided on 3 major charges that the Nazi officials would face, and that they would each be allowed a defending counsel.
The prisoners are kept under day and night surveillance by United States armed guards. They are fed like ordinary criminals. And as Robert H. Jackson, chief American prosecutor, completes his case, plans move ahead. Through this tunnel, the Nazis will be taken to the courtroom, now being rebuilt for the trial in mid-November. The indictment represents the first time 4 different nations and systems of justice have been welded to try war criminals. It also condemns the whole Nazi party for crimes against humanity. Justice catches up with the monsters of fascism.
The trial was set to put the horrors of the Nazi regime on display for the world to see. With plans to broadcast live, this trial would go down in history as one of the most symbolic executions of justice. The world would not tolerate such hate crimes ever again. The International Military Tribunal, formed by the Allies, was given the task of trying 24 of the most important political and military leaders of the Third Reich. The purpose being to bring Nazi criminals to justice, for the peace of mind of the survivors, and for the victims' families.
You've got some pretty big figures missing from that dock at Nuremberg. The biggest figure not there is Adolf Hitler. Another huge figure not there is Joseph Goebbels, the Minister of Propaganda. Another massive figure who is also not there is a man called Heinrich Himmler, who was head of the SS. They'd all committed suicide. There are some who say that Hitler escaped. That's complete nonsense. They'd all committed suicide, and they'd ultimately cheated justice. They knew what would have happened to them had they been put on trial. They would have been hanged. Ultimately, you do have some of the key figures in the Third Reich have cheated Nuremberg, and they've cheated the hangman's noose, and they've chosen either a self-inflicted bullet or a suicide capsule to take their way out.
The best known of the Nuremberg trials was the trial of major war criminals, held from November 20th, 1945 to October 1st, 1946. The format of the trial was a mix of legal traditions. There were prosecutors and defense attorneys according to British and American law, but the decisions and sentences were imposed by a tribunal rather than a single judge and a jury. Each of the 4 Allied powers supplied 2 judges, a main judge and an alternate. 20th October 1945. The trial of major war criminals begins. 24 leading Nazi Party members are sitting in the court, unaware of the mass amounts of evidence against them. Martin Bormann, known among the inner circle as Hitler's shadow, was still missing, but put on trial in absentia. They were accused of crimes against peace, war crimes, crimes against humanity, and conspiracy.
And the charter of this tribunal annexed thereto hereby accuse as guilty in the respects hereinafter set forth of crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity, and of a common plan or conspiracy to commit those crimes, all as defined in the charter of the tribunal, and accordingly name as defendants in this cause and as indicted on the counts hereinafter set out Hermann Wilhelm Goering, Rudolf Hess, Joachim von Ribbentrop, Robert Ley, Wilhelm Keitel, Ernst Kaltenbrunner, Alfred Rosenberg, Hans Frank, Wilhelm Frick, Julius Streicher, Walter Funk, Hjalmar Schacht, Gustav Krupp von Bohlen und Halbach, Karl Dönitz, Erich Raeder, Baldur von Schirach, Fritz Saukel, Alfred Jodl, Martin Bormann, Franz von Papen, Arthur or conspiracy.
Nazi organizations such as the Schutzstaffel SS or the Gestapo Secret State Police were also indicted as criminal organizations. As the accused men and judges spoke 4 different languages, the trial saw the introduction of a technological innovation taken for granted today: instantaneous translation. Technology was provided and men and women were recruited from international telephone exchanges to provide on-the-spot translations through headphones in English, French, German, and Russian. 21st October, 1945. Robert H. Jackson, the lead prosecutor, delivered his opening speech, which lasted several hours and left a great impression on the court and the public.
When the International Military Tribunal began, it was opened by the American Chief Prosecutor, Robert Jackson. And so in his opening speech, he knew that this was very, very significant. He made a very, very powerful opening speech talking about the kind of role and responsibility that this tribunal had in really sort of making a very, very forceful and judicial process against crimes against the peace of the world. So the kind of basic peacekeeping for the future after this terrible Second World War.
The privilege of opening the first trial in history for crimes against the peace of the world imposes a grave responsibility. The wrongs which we seek to condemn and punish have been so calculated, so malignant and so devastating that civilization cannot tolerate their being ignored because it cannot survive their being repeated. That 4 great nations, flushed with victory and stung with injury, stay the hand of vengeance and voluntarily submit their captive enemies to the judgment of the law is one of the most significant tributes that power has ever paid to reason.
His speech was important because he was aware that it was not just being heard in the confines of the courtroom, although that was important enough, but of course it was being reported on by the press, not just in Germany, but around the world. And again, it was not just in the kind of geography and confines of the courtroom there and then, and in history there and then, because it was the ramifications of it and the implications of it forever after. So the Nuremberg trial was unprecedented. It was a response really to the Nazi regime of its very brutal and irrational crimes, sort of met in a very rational way by the victorious Allies, where they were giving the defendants the opportunity to defend themselves, to show any penitence if they did, although they didn't.
29th November, 1945. The film Nazi Concentration and Prison Camps is screened to the court. This shows the extent of the corruption and unbelievable crimes committed by the Nazi Party. The conditions of these death camps are shocking, bringing reality to the whole situation. There was said to be an oppressive atmosphere during the trial. One woman accompanying the defense attorneys said the courtroom was very serious, quiet, and oppressive. You could feel an atmosphere loaded with shame. The prosecution does not leave any important detail out, no matter how horrific it may be. The trial is continuing at a fast pace. Rudolf Hess, having spent most of the war imprisoned in England, was claiming to have amnesia and supposedly could not remember his involvement with the Nazi Party. His defense attempted to plead to the court that he was mentally unstable.
Court is to decide solely the question of whether the defendant is fit or unfit to be heard, and further, whether he might even be considered entirely responsible. If his inability to plead is recognized, I request that the proceedings against the defendant not be conducted in his absence.
Is it not consistent with all the medical opinions that the defendant is capable of understanding the course of the proceedings, and that the only defect from which he is suffering is forgetfulness about what happened before he flew to England?
Herr Vorsitzender, es ist richtig.
Mr. President, it is true that the experts consider the defendant Hess capable of following the proceedings. But on the other hand, in answer to the questions put to them, they emphasize that the defendant is not capable of defending himself.
He has refused every simple treatment that has been suggested. He's refused to submit to the ordinary things that we submit to every day, blood tests, examinations, and says he will submit to nothing until after the trial.
None of the defendants would admit their personal guilt. Hardly anyone showed remorse or admitted knowing about massacres and extermination camps. Of the top Nazi officials, Hermann Göring is considered the highest-ranking Nazi to have survived the war, and therefore the main target for the prosecution.
He goes from being a First World War fighter pilot hero who's got the Pour le Mérite medal, which is the highest medal that can be won by the German fighting man in the First World War. And so he's a venerated pilot, very successful fighter pilot during the First World War, who then kind of loses his way somewhat. And then when he falls in with the Nazis in Munich in the 20s, he's feeling that's giving him a kind of sense of purpose. And the problem is that he's on the famous beer hall putsch in 1923, and he gets shot and wounded. And when he's recuperating from his wounds, he's given morphine, heroin, effectively. And it's that he becomes addicted to. And it's at Nuremberg, when he's off the drugs, when he loses weight, his brain suddenly gets sharper again. And of all the Nazis in the dock at Nuremberg, he's the most impressive. And that old flash of intelligence and brilliance that's got him to the top of the Nazi tree is shown once more.
Göring had a great persuasion and power during the Nazi regime. Being named Hitler's successor by the Führer himself, Hermann Göring believed he was invincible. Göring's trial at Nuremberg was set to be one of the most significant trials. He provided the last direct link to Hitler, assuming that Martin Bormann was in fact dead. 13th March 1946. Hermann Göring takes the stand. He attempts to keep his pride intact, whilst facing ruthless questions from the prosecution. The intense questioning lasts for 9 days.
wollte ich noch ausführen, dass eine Verfügung erlassen worden war, durch mich und Frick gemeinsam, dass Männer, die in das Konzentrationslager eingeliefert, also Persönlichkeiten eingeliefert wurden, dass ihnen nach 24 Stunden der Grund ihrer Einlieferung bekannt gegeben werden sollte und sie nach 48 Stunden, oder es war jedenfalls eine enge Beschränkung, einen Anwalt, das Recht auf einen Anwalt hatten. Damit aber...
And you also had to have certain organizations to carry out orders, executive organizations, organizations to fight for you if necessary. Did you not?
Ja, Verwaltungsorganisationen sind selbstverständlich notwendig. Ich verstehe nicht Organisation zu welchem Kampfe.
Well, if you wanted certain people killed, you had to have some organization that would kill them, didn't you? Rome and the rest of them were not killed by Hitler's own hands, nor by yours, were they?
Röhm, die Affäre Röhm habe ich hier deutlich ausgeführt. Das war ein Staatsnotakt.
Well, I'm not asking...
Und ist durch die Polizei durchgeführt worden.
Yes, but when it was state necessity to kill somebody, you had to have somebody to do it, didn't you?
Ja, wie in anderen Staaten auch, ob das nun Secret Service heißt oder woanders, weiß ich nicht.
And the SA and the SS and the SD, organizations of that kind, were the organizations that carried out the orders and dealt with people on a physical level. Were they not?
Die SA hat niemals einen Befehl bekommen, irgendjemand zu töten. Die SS zu meiner Zeit auch nicht, also ich hatte ja auf sie keinen Einfluss. Und die einzigen Befehle, wo ohne Gericht, ich weiß, dass also Befehle zur Exekutionsvollstreckung gegeben worden sind, war gegen einige Personen im Röhmputsch und die sind durch die Polizei vollzogen worden, also durch das Staatsorgan.
At what time did the SS perform this function of acting as the executor of the Nazi Party?
Nach der Machtergreifung die Polizei mehr und mehr in die Hände von Himmler gelangt ist, kann sich für ein Außenstehenden nicht mehr klar das Bild abzeichnen, wo war SS tätig, wo war Geheime Staatspolizei tätig und so weiter. Ich sagte vorhin schon, dass dann diese beiden sehr eng zusammengefasst wurden.
Do you still say that neither Hitler nor you knew of the policy to exterminate the Jews?
Soweit es mich betrifft, habe ich gesagt, dass...
I already have said that not even approximately did I know to what degree this thing took place.
You did not know to what degree, but you knew there was a policy that aimed at the liquidation of the Jews.
Nein, auf die Auswanderung der Juden und nicht auf ihre
No, not liquidation of the Jews. I only knew that certain perpetrations had taken place.
The Public Act was on the 22nd of April, 1938, when you published penalties for veiling the character of a Jewish enterprise within the Reich. Was it not?
Jawohl.
SS Gruppenführer to make the plans for the complete solution of the Jewish question.
Nein, so ist das nicht richtig. Diesen Erlass,
I asked to have you shown,
kenne ich genau.
I asked to have you shown document 710, United States 509. Correct so far?
Nein, das ist in keiner Weise korrekt in der deutschen Sprache.
Give us your translation of it. Give it.
Der Ihnen bereits mit Erlass vom 24.01.39, also vor Kriegsbeginn, übertragenen Aufgabe, die Judenfrage in Form der Auswanderung oder Evakuierung einer den Zeitverhältnissen entsprechend möglichst günstigsten Lösung zuzuführen, beauftrage ich Sie hiermit, alle erforderlichen Vorbereitungen in organisatorischer, sachlicher und materieller Hinsicht zu treffen. Und jetzt kommt das entscheidende Wort, das falsch übersetzt wurde. Es heißt hier nämlich, für eine Gesamtlösung, nicht für eine Endlösung. Für eine Gesamtlösung der Judenfrage im deutschen Einflussgebiet in Europa.
This letter itself was directed to the chief of the security police and the security service and SS Gruppenführer Heydrich. We're right about that, aren't we?
Das ist richtig, und dazu muss ich aber nun die Erklärung abgeben.
And. All right.
Die Erklärung abgeben, dass ich deshalb den Brief an ihn gerichtet habe, weil Heydrich mit Erlass vom 24.01.39 beziehungsweise Himmler die Aufgabe der Judenauswanderung übertragen war. Folgedessen war dies die Zentralstelle. Und ich musste mich für die ganzen materiellen und wirtschaftlich sich daraus ergebenden Dinge an die Stelle wenden, welche den Zentralauftrag hatte.
Telling this tribunal, when you say that no steps were to be taken by anyone else, whether you are telling this tribunal the truth.
Dieses ist ein Vermerk von meiner Dienststelle oder Adjutantur, dass von dieser Seite nichts unternommen wird, weil ich betont habe, die Sache nehme ich selbst in die Hand. Ich bin nämlich mit diesem Bericht zum Führer gegangen.
20th June 1946. Albert Speer takes the stand. He's the only defendant who seems to take personal responsibility for his actions. He also keeps no secrets, exposing other members of the former party.
You were present on April 23, 1945, when Hitler received the telegram from Goering suggesting that he take over power. What did Hitler say on that occasion?
Hitler war außerordentlich erregt über den Inhalt dieses Telegrammes.
Hitler was most excited about the contents of the telegram, and he expressed himself in a very clear manner about Goering. He said that he knew for some time that Goering had failed, that he was corrupt, that he was a drug addict. It was typical of Hitler's attitude toward the entire problem, however, that he followed this statement up by saying, but he can, nevertheless, negotiate the capitulation. He stated in an offhand manner, it doesn't really matter who does it. His disregard for the German nation was expressed in the way he said this. The tremendous danger contained in this totalitarian system only became really clear the moment we were approaching the end. Everything that has happened during this trial, everything you have seen in the way of orders which were carried out without any hesitation, did after all turn out to be mistaken. That is why this trial must contribute to the prevention of such distorted wars in the future and to the establishment of principles for human cooperation.
Every superior Nazi that sat in the dock attempted to deflect blame, denying knowing the full extent of the crimes committed. and showed no remorse for the victims of the Holocaust caused by the Nazi state. The prosecution provided many examples of the unprecedented, inhumane conduct of Nazi Germany.
There is no doubt that Mauthausen was the basis for long-term planning. It was constructed as a gigantic stone fortress on top of a mountain flanked by small barracks. Mauthausen, in addition to its permanency of construction, had facilities for a large garrison of officers and men, and had large dining rooms and toilet facilities for the staff. It was conducted with the sole purpose in mind of exterminating any so-called prisoner who entered within its walls. The so-called branches of Mauthausen were under direct command of the SS officials located there. All records, orders, and administrative facilities were handled for these branches through Mauthausen. The other camps, including Gusen and Ebensee, its two most notorious and largest branches, were not exclusively used for extermination, but prisoners were used as tools in construction and production until they were beaten or starved into uselessness, whereupon they were customarily sent to Mauthausen for final disposal. End of the quotation.
The tribunal discussed Nazi Germany's anti-Semitic policy on different occasions. Over 800 documents and more than 30 witnesses referred to the persecution of the Jews.
With the coming of the Nazis into power in 1933, persecution of the Jews became official state policy. In September 1935, the so-called Nuremberg laws were passed, the most important effect of which was to deprive Jews of German citizenship. In this way, the influence of Jewish elements on the affairs of Germany was extinguished, and one more potential source of opposition to Nazi policy was rendered powerless.
This exhibit, which is on the table, is a human head with the skull bone removed, shrunken, stuffed, and preserved. The Nazis had one of their many victims decapitated after having had him hanged, apparently for fraternizing with a German woman, and fashioned this terrible ornament from his head. The last paragraph of the official United States Army report, from which I have just read, deals with the manner in which this exhibit was acquired.
In 218 trial days, the court heard 240 witnesses and examined more than 300,000 written statements.
So the trial was a rational and civilized response to the irrationality and the brutality of the Nazi regime.
What Nuremberg represents to so many of these Nazis is a real reckoning that they never thought they were going to receive. Maybe some of the smarter ones in the dying days of the war thought maybe, but actually the whole idea of the Reich was not meant to be a 12-year Reich, it was supposed to be a 1,000-year Reich. And in fact, that what was going to happen is that people were going to be treating them as demigods, and statues would be erected and buildings enshrined to them, for hundreds of years, not actually, hanging from some grubby rope in the prison courtyard in Nuremberg, which is what happened to them. So they went from kind of being demigods to criminal lowlife very quickly.
4th July 1946. The final statements for the defense are heard.
After months of examination and cross-examination, several defendants make final statements to the tribunal. Frank is first.
I myself, speaking from the very depth of my sentiments, and from the experience of 5 months of this trial, want to say this. Now that I've gained the last insight into all that which has been committed in the way of dreadful atrocities, I feel a terrible guilt within me.
Funk declares,
Als mir nun diese Terror- und Gewaltmaßnahmen gegen die Juden
When these measures of terror and violence against Jews were put up to me, I suffered a nervous breakdown, because at the moment it came to my mind with full clearness that from here on the catastrophe took its course all the way up to the terrible and atrocious things about which we have heard, and about which I knew only in part at the time of my imprisonment. I felt ashamed and guilty at that moment, and I feel the same way today, but it's too late.
Now Schirach speaks.
It is my guilt that I educated German youth for a man who committed murders millionfold.
Schach is next.
Denn hat alles, was vorher dem deutschen Volke und damit auch mir versprochen hatte.
Everything he promised to the German people and thereby to himself, he did not afterwards keep. He promised equal rights for all citizens, and without regard to their capabilities, his adherents got privileges before all other citizens. He promised to fight against political lies, and together with his minister Goebbels and by himself, he never did anything but disseminate political lies and political fraud. He released criminals and put them into his service. He did everything in a way of not keeping his promises. He deceived the world, Germany, and me.
Spare once more.
The tremendous danger contained in this totalitarian system only became really clear the moment we were approaching the end. Everything that has happened during this trial, everything you have seen in the way of orders which were carried out without any hesitation, did after all turn out to be mistaken. That is why this trial must contribute to the prevention of such distorted wars in the future and to the establishment of principles for human cooperation.
And Keitel again.
Ich habe geirrt. War nicht imstande.
I erred. I was not able to prevent what should have been prevented. That is my guilt. I can only wish that out of a clear recognition of the causes, of the disastrous methods, and the terrible consequences of this war, there will arise for the German people a new hope for a better future in the community of nations.
Now Frank.
Wir rufen das deutsche Volk, dessen Machtträger wir mit waren.
We call on the German people, whose representatives we were, to abandon this way, which was doomed to failure in the will and justice of God, and which is doomed for everyone who may try to follow it, anywhere in the world.
The last defendant to speak is Fritzsche.
Nun, Sie haben von Hitler nichts Gutes erwartet.
You of the prosecution did not expect anything good from Hitler, and you are amazed about the extent of what really happened. But then try to understand the indignation of those who did expect something good from Hitler and were betrayed. I am one of these betrayed.
26th July, 1946. The prosecution make their final statements.
Credibility is one of the main issues of this trial. Only those who have failed to learn the bitter lesson of the last decade can doubt that men who have always played on the unsuspecting credulity of generous opponents would not hesitate to do the same now. It is against such a background that these defendants now ask this tribunal to say that they are not guilty of planning, executing, or conspiring to commit this long list of crimes and wrongs. They stand before the record of this tribunal as blood-stained Gloucester stood by the body of his slain king. He begged of the widow, as they beg of you, say I slew them not. And the Queen replied, then say they were not slain, but dead they are. If you were to say of these men that they are not guilty, it would be as true to say that there has been no war, that there are no slain, that there has been no crime.
31st of August, 1946. Last statements by the defendants. 1st of September, 1946. The court adjourns. 30th of September and October 1st, 1946. The sentencing occurs, taking 2 days, with the individual sentences read out on the afternoon of the
Of the organizations, the SS, SD, Gestapo, and Leadership Corps are found guilty. The High Command, SA, and Reich Cabinet not guilty. As for the individual, Wilhelm Hermann Goering, guilty of conspiracy, crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. Death by hanging. Rudolf Hess, guilty of conspiracy and crimes against peace. Life imprisonment. Joachim von Ribbentrop, guilty of conspiracy, crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. Death by hanging. Wilhelm Keitel, guilty of conspiracy, crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. Death by hanging. Ernst Kaltenbrunner, guilty of war crimes and crimes against humanity. Death by hanging. Alfred Rosenberg, guilty of conspiracy, crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. Death by hanging. Hans Frank, guilty of war crimes and crimes against humanity. Death by hanging. Wilhelm Frick, guilty of crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. Death by hanging. Julius Streicher, guilty of crimes against humanity. Death by hanging. Walter Funk, guilty of crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. Life imprisonment. Hjalmar Schacht, not guilty on this indictment, released. Karl Dönitz, guilty of crimes against peace and war crimes, 10 years imprisonment. Erich Raeder, guilty of conspiracy, crimes against peace, and war crimes, life imprisonment. Baldur von Schirach, guilty of crimes against humanity, 20 years imprisonment. Fritz Saukel, guilty of war crimes and crimes against humanity, death by hanging. Alfred Jodl, guilty of conspiracy, crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity, death by hanging. Franz von Papen, not guilty on this indictment, released. Albert Speer, guilty of war crimes and crimes against humanity, 20 years imprisonment. Konstantin von Neurath, guilty of conspiracy, crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity, 15 years imprisonment. Arthur Seyss-Inquart, guilty of crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity, death by hanging. Hans Fritzsche, not guilty on this indictment, released. Martin Bormann, tried in absentia, guilty of war crimes and crimes against humanity, death by hanging.
12 of the accused were sentenced to death. 7 received prison sentences ranging from 10 years to life sentence. 3 were acquitted, and 2 were not charged. The death sentences were carried out 10 days later on 16 October 1946.
The main 20 or so who are in the dock at the military tribunal at Nuremberg, the Nuremberg trial as people think of it, they all received some form of justice. Anything ranging from several years in prison to being hanged by the neck until they were dead. Most of them saw out their sentences. Those who were sentenced to death were largely hanged, except crucially one of them, and that was Hermann Goering, who the night before his execution managed to pop a cyanide pill, and he killed himself. It was his last kind of two fingers, if you like, to the Allies. Even today, no one knows how he got the cyanide pill. There are lots and lots of conspiracy theories about it. In a sense, it doesn't matter. What it does mean, though, is that actually Goering sort of kind of played his ace right at the very end. So ultimately, yeah, he may have killed himself, but that was better than being killed by his enemy.
The trial is over. Seven begin their prison sentences. Goering chooses to die by his own hand. The other 10 wait for the gallows. In Nuremberg, the people of the world found out what happened and why. But Nuremberg is more than an answer to a question. As Justice Jackson said, this trial is part of the great effort to make the peace more secure. It constitutes juridical action of a kind to ensure that those who start a war will pay for it personally. Nuremberg stands as a warning to all those who plan and wage aggressive war.
The Nuremberg trial was certainly of groundbreaking significance. The creation of the IMT was followed by trials of lesser Nazi officials and the trials of Nazi doctors who performed experiments on people in prison camps. The influence of the tribunal can also be seen in the proposals for a permanent international criminal court and the drafting of international criminal codes, later prepared by the International Law Commission. Most importantly, the trial saw justice served to leaders of the Nazi Party, providing closure for the victims of the Holocaust and those greatly affected by the regime. Germany was ready to heal, learn from the mistakes, and rebuild.